The snow came down in thick, blinding sheets, swallowing the road ahead. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale under the dashboard's dim glow. The windshield wipers battled against the relentless snowfall, their rhythmic screech barely keeping up. The highway was a ghost town. No headlights in the distance, no taillights fading ahead, just an unbroken stretch of icy asphalt and swirling white. His truck shuddered under a sudden gust of wind, tires skidding slightly before regaining traction. A curse escaped his lips. The storm was only getting worse. He needed to stop, soon. The gas station appeared like an apparition in the storm, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the swirling snow. Ethan exhaled sharply and pulled in, his headlights cutting through the night. The place was abandoned, save for a single dimly lit convenience store. Killing the engine, he leaned back into the worn leather seat, savoring the moment of stillness. The silence of the empty lot wrapped around him, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. Just another stop. Just another night alone on the road. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion weighing down his limbs. 47 years old, and this was his life. A long-haul driver with no real home, no real ties. The road had been his only companion since Sarah passed. He reached for the flask in the glove compartment, hesitating before shoving it back. Not tonight. Instead, he let his head rest against the seat, listening to the eerie quiet that came with solitude. A quiet he'd long learned to accept. Then, through the wind's relentless howl, a sound cut through the storm. A bark, hoarse, desperate and distant. Ethan stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head, peering through the frosted glass. The gas station remained lifeless, the store's weak light barely illuminating the lot. The bark came again. Closer this time. Urgent. Ethan's pulse quickened. Out here, in this storm? Someone's dog, maybe, or something else. He never cared much for animals. They were messy, unpredictable. Attachments he couldn't afford. But something about that sound. It struck something deep, something he hadn't thought about in years. A night like this. A storm, a whimpering creature left behind. His grip tightened on the fuel pump. Was this a memory, or just another ghost of the past? The wind howled, and the bark turned into a frantic whimper. The storm was swallowing the sound. Whatever was out there wouldn't last long. Ethan clenched his jaw. His fingers hovered over the door handle. He could ignore it. Pretend he hadn't heard. But something inside him, the part he thought had frozen over long ago, told him otherwise. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped into the storm. Ethan's steps froze as the barking intensified, frantic, pleading, cutting through the howling wind like a distress call. The sound drilled into his chest, a sharp contrast to the eerie silence of the empty road behind him. He had been walking home, head down, ignoring the cold that bit through his jacket. But now he couldn't ignore it. The urgency in that bark clawed at something deep inside him, something he had buried long ago. His breath puffed out in white clouds as he turned his head toward the sound. Through the darkness, barely illuminated by the flickering streetlight, Ethan spotted it. A German shepherd, drenched and shivering, its chain rattling against the old wire fence as it struggled weakly. Mud clung to its fur, its ribs visible beneath the soaked coat. The dog's ears were pinned back, but there was no aggression in its stance, only desperation. Its legs trembled, barely holding its weight, as if it had been fighting for far too long. The rattling chain sent a metallic chime into the night, a haunting melody of suffering. Ethan's gaze flicked beyond the dog. A few feet away, a broken cage door swung wildly in the wind, its hinges screeching in protest. The ground beneath it was a mess of deep claw marks, scattered debris, and something darker, blood. His stomach twisted as he noticed the raw wounds on the dog's paws, the torn pads, the red streaks trailing from the cage to where it stood now. The dog had fought for its freedom, but from what? His eyes scanned the area, but the storm masked any other signs of movement. The dog wasn't barking anymore. It just stood there, chest heaving, eyes locked onto his. Not wild, not feral, just waiting. As if it had already decided Ethan was its last hope. It didn't whimper, didn't growl, just stared. Its eyes, a deep amber, glowed with exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, there was something else. Hope. A silent, unwavering plea. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't some hero, some rescuer of lost things. People had their own battles. He had his. The last time he had let himself care, he had been the one left with scars. He turned away, forcing himself to move, to let the night swallow the sound, the sight, the guilt. It wasn't his responsibility. He told himself that over and over, but his feet wouldn't move. A sharp thud snapped his attention back. The dog had collapsed. 1 second it had been standing watching him, and the next it was on the ground, sides heaving, its body too weak to hold itself up any longer. Ethan cursed under his breath. His hands clenched into fists. Walk away. Just walk away. But his feet betrayed him, carrying him forward before he could stop himself. His knees hit the wet ground beside the animal. It didn't flinch, didn't fight, just looked up at him, those amber eyes dull with exhaustion. Damn it. Ethan hesitated before reaching out. His fingers brushed the matted fur, damp and ice cold. The dog barely stirred, its breath shallow. His heart pounded as he scooped the animal into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, but beneath the weight there was something else. The weight of a decision he couldn't take back. He carried the dog toward his truck, his mind racing with questions he had no answers to. Was he saving a stray or inviting trouble into his life? Either way, it was too late now. The steady hum of the engine filled the car as Ethan navigated the empty road, his fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. A weight settled against his lap. He glanced down. The German Shepherd, curled up on the passenger seat, had shifted, resting its head against his leg. A silent plea. Ethan stiffened. He wasn't used to this quiet dependence. He kept his eyes on the road, pretending not to notice the warmth radiating from the dog's body. But the moment lingered. The storm that raged outside had driven them together, two souls escaping an unseen force. He exhaled, adjusting his grip on the wheel. "You're just along for the ride," he muttered, mostly to himself. But Shadow, as Ethan would later call him, didn't move. He just stayed there, trusting, waiting, and despite himself, Ethan let him. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'll drop you off at the next town," he muttered, casting a quick glance at the dog. Shadow didn't react, just watched him with those deep brown eyes, unreadable yet knowing. Ethan shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. "I don't do attachments," he told the dog, told himself. "Someone's probably looking for you." But even as he spoke, the words rang hollow. The idea of handing Shadow over to some stranger left an unexpected weight in his chest. It was ridiculous. He had picked up strays before, helped them find homes, moved on. This was no different. At least, that's what he tried to believe. Ethan pulled into an abandoned gas station, stretching his arms as he shut off the engine. He turned to the dog, who sat upright, watching him. "You need a name," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Silence stretched between them. "Can't just keep calling you dog." He studied the thick coat, the way the night clung to it. "Shadow," he finally said. "That fits, huh?" Shadow's ears twitched, as if considering the name, and then he let out a quiet huff. Ethan chuckled, surprising himself. "All right, Shadow it is." The moment felt oddly significant. Naming something meant claiming it, didn't it? And yet, as Shadow shifted closer, Ethan couldn't bring himself to regret it. Ethan tossed a can of dog food onto the passenger seat. "Eat," he instructed, prying the lid off. The smell was awful, but Shadow didn't even glance at it. Ethan frowned. "You're hungry, I know you are." Shadow merely stared ahead, unmoving. Frustration pricked at Ethan. He had done his part, offered food, shelter. That should be enough. Yet the dog's silent defiance unsettled him. He sighed, grabbing a piece of beef jerky from his bag. "Fine." He ripped off a small chunk and held it out. "This is the best you're getting." Shadow hesitated, then, with slow deliberation, took the piece from his fingers. Ethan smirked. Stubborn? Maybe they had more in common than he thought. The wind howled outside as Ethan stretched out in the driver's seat, trying to find some comfort. A soft whimper broke the silence. His eyes snapped open. Shadow lay curled on the floor, breathing unevenly. Ethan sat up, frowning. "What's wrong?" The dog didn't respond, just let out another quiet sound. Without thinking, Ethan reached down, pressing a hand against Shadow's side, too warm. "You're sick," he murmured, a thread of worry creeping into his voice. He exhaled sharply. Damn it. He hadn't planned on this. Taking the dog was one thing, but caring for him? That was a different level of involvement. Yet, as Shadow shivered, Ethan reached for his jacket and gently draped it over him. Because, temporary or not, he couldn't just ignore him. The shelter sign loomed ahead, its bright letters glowing against the darkening sky. Ethan pulled into the parking lot and stared at the entrance. This is the right thing to do, he told himself. Shadow sat beside him, unaware of what was about to happen. Or maybe he knew. Maybe that's why he kept looking at Ethan with those eyes, silent, patient. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't a damn hero. He had no place keeping a dog, no matter how much he'd gotten used to the company. He reached for the door handle but hesitated. Why did this feel so wrong? Ethan stepped out of the car, leash in hand. Shadow hesitated but followed. The moment they reached the entrance, a low whine escaped the dog's throat. Ethan swallowed hard. "You'll be fine," he muttered, more to himself than Shadow. But as he took a step back, Shadow lunged forward, pressing against his legs, ears pinned. Ethan froze. The dog trembled. For the first time, the idea of walking away felt impossible. His hand tightened around the leash. Every logical part of him screamed to follow through, to let go. But his feet didn't move. The car radio crackled as Ethan drove away. Shadow curled in the passenger seat once more. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Guess you win." Just then, a news bulletin broke through. Missing German Shepherd. Family searching for weeks. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. He turned up the volume. Last seen near the highway. Responds to the name Duke. Silence filled the car. He glanced at Shadow. "Duke?" The dog looked up at him, head tilting slightly. A pit formed in Ethan's stomach. He wasn't just a stray, he belonged to someone. For the first time, Ethan wondered if keeping Shadow, Duke, wasn't his choice to make. The bond between them had formed so naturally, but was it meant to last? And, more importantly, could he bring himself to say goodbye? The low hum of conversation in the diner felt like background noise to Ethan, who was absently stirring his coffee. Shadow lay curled at his feet, his fur rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. It had been weeks since Ethan had found him. Thin, scared, but full of quiet resilience. Now, Shadow was beginning to trust again, finding comfort in his presence. But that fragile sense of security shattered the moment Ethan noticed a man sitting across the diner, his gaze fixed on Shadow with an unsettling intensity. Ethan's grip on his mug tightened. The man's expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried something dark: ownership, possession. Then, as if coming to a decision, the man stood and strode toward them. "That's my dog." His voice was flat, his hand gripping a leash that dangled at his side. The diner quieted, conversations fading as eyes turned toward them. Ethan's heart pounded. Shadow stiffened, his body tense, ears pinned back against his head. A tremor ran through him, a silent plea that spoke louder than words. Ethan knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Shadow knew this man, and he was terrified. A murmur rippled through the diner. A voice, barely above a whisper, reached Ethan's ears. "That's Kurt." Ethan turned slightly, his brows furrowing. The name meant nothing to him, but the reaction from the other patrons said enough. "They say he runs fights," another voice muttered. "Dogs that lose don't get a second chance." Ethan's breath caught. His gaze fell on Shadow, and suddenly, every small hesitation, every flinch made sense. The scars beneath his fur, the way he recoiled at loud noises, the moments of frozen fear. All pieces of a nightmare Shadow had barely escaped from. Kurt's voice cut through the thick tension. "You gonna give him back, or do I have to take him?" Ethan swallowed hard. Shadow pressed against his leg, his body trembling. There was no mistaking it now. Shadow was terrified of this man, and Ethan wasn't about to hand him over. Kurt took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. "Look, buddy, let's not make this harder than it has to be." He lifted the leash. "Come on, boy." But Shadow didn't move. If anything, he shrank back, his eyes darting up to Ethan, pleading. Ethan exhaled, his jaw tightening. He felt the weight of the room pressing in, watchful eyes, silent expectations. Maybe no one would stop him if he handed Shadow over. Maybe some people even thought he should. But then he looked down at the dog beside him. The one who had trusted him enough to stay. The one who had spent weeks learning that not all humans were cruel. And he knew his answer. Ethan straightened his shoulders. "He's not going anywhere with you." The silence in the diner stretched thin, tension crackling in the air like a brewing storm. Then, without warning, Kurt moved. The leash swung as he lunged, his hand reaching for Shadow's collar. A deep, guttural growl ripped through the diner. Shadow, the dog who had cowered at every sudden movement, now bared his teeth, his stance firm, unwavering. Kurt froze, his outstretched hand hovering in midair. Shadow's growl wasn't mindless aggression. It was a warning, a declaration. He was done running. Before Kurt could make another move, a voice boomed from behind the counter. "Enough." The diner owner, an older man with a no-nonsense glare, had already picked up the phone. "I'm calling the police." Kurt's expression flickered, a mixture of fury and calculation. He glanced around, realizing too many eyes were on him, too many people standing witness. With a sharp glare at Ethan, he turned and strode toward the exit. The bell above the door jingled as he disappeared into the night. The diner remained silent for a long moment before the hum of conversation returned. Softer, more hesitant. Ethan knelt beside Shadow, running a hand through his fur. The dog was still trembling, but as Ethan's hand lingered, He exhaled a slow, shaky breath and leaned into the touch. "You're safe now," Ethan murmured. Shadow met his gaze, and something passed between them, understanding, relief, belonging. Ethan had thought he was rescuing Shadow when he first found him, but now, as he looked into the dog's eyes, he realized the truth. Shadow had saved him too. No more running, no more fear. They had found their home, in each other. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number, his voice firm but edged with emotion. "I have information about an illegal dog-fighting ring," he told the dispatcher, his gaze drifting to Shadow, curled up beside him. The authorities arrived swiftly, their flashing lights illuminating the dark alley where Kurt had once ruled with cruelty. Shadow watched, ears perked, as the officers led Kurt away in handcuffs, his protests drowned out by the crackle of the radio. Justice had been served. Ethan felt a weight lift off his chest. Shadow was finally safe. Days later, Ethan stood outside the courthouse, gripping Shadow's leash as the judge's decision echoed in his mind. "Shadow is officially in your care." Relief surged through him. The battered, broken creature he had rescued was no longer a stray, no longer a victim. Shadow was family. He knelt, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. "Looks like you're stuck with me now, buddy," he murmured, his voice laced with warmth. Shadow responded with a gentle nudge against his arm, as if he too understood that this was their fresh start. For years, Ethan had embraced solitude, the open road his only companion. But now, the rhythmic sound of paws against pavement echoed alongside his footsteps. Shadow adjusted quickly to life in the truck, curling up on the passenger seat, his eyes keenly watching the road ahead. At truck stops, people gravitated toward the pair. Some to admire Shadow, others to exchange stories with Ethan. The once lonely trucker found himself laughing more, talking more. He hadn't just rescued a dog, he had unknowingly opened his life to something he never realized he needed: companionship. The miles stretched endlessly, but this time the road didn't feel so empty. Shadow's presence filled the quiet spaces between radio songs and the hum of tires against asphalt. They developed a routine: long drives, quick rest stops, and shared meals. Ethan even caught himself talking to Shadow about everything and nothing. "You think I should take that job offer in Oregon?" he asked one evening. Shadow tilted his head, letting out a soft woof. Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: wherever Ethan went, Shadow would be right there with him. One night, parked at a scenic overlook, Ethan stepped out of the truck, Shadow following close behind. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but out here, the world felt still, peaceful. Ethan sank onto the cool metal of the truck's step, and Shadow rested his head against Ethan's knee. No words were needed. The journey they had taken, through pain, loss, and unexpected salvation, spoke louder than anything Ethan could say. He scratched behind Shadow's ears, exhaling deeply. "We've come a long way, huh?" Shadow responded with a slow, contented blink, a silent promise of loyalty and trust. As Ethan looked up at the night sky, the weight of their shared past settled in his chest. He had believed he was saving Shadow, pulling the dog from a life of cruelty and fear. But the truth was undeniable. Shadow had saved him too. Before Shadow, Ethan had been drifting, carrying wounds of his own, ones that time alone couldn't heal. Now, as the stars flickered above them, he finally understood. They weren't just two souls who had found each other. They were two lives forever changed by one act of rescue, bound by a love that neither had sought, but both had needed. Ethan sat on the porch, his fingers absent-mindedly running through Shadow's thick fur. The stars stretched endlessly above them, a silent witness to their journey. He had always thought owning a dog meant being its master, setting the rules, and expecting obedience. But Shadow had taught him something different. True companionship wasn't about control. It was about trust, respect, and mutual care. Shadow had chosen to stay, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And that made all the difference. Both Ethan and Shadow had carried their own burdens. Ethan, weighed down by a past he couldn't change, and Shadow, scarred by abandonment and fear. But together they had found something neither of them had alone: peace. Each step they had taken side by side, each battle fought, each quiet night like this one had woven them together piece by piece. The pain didn't vanish overnight, but in each other's presence the wounds began to heal. They had survived the storm, not just of the world, but the one inside them. Their bond was more than just man and dog. It was something unshakable, forged in struggle and triumph. Ethan had never trusted so completely before, never felt this kind of loyalty that ran deeper than words. And Shadow? The once wary dog who flinched at every sound now stood confidently beside him, no longer just surviving, but truly living. They were proof that love and loyalty could overcome even the deepest wounds, even those unseen. Ethan exhaled, a soft chuckle escaping as he looked down at Shadow, who gazed up at him with those knowing eyes. He had thought he was the rescuer, the savior who had given Shadow a second chance. But the truth settled in his heart like a warm ember. Shadow had saved him just as much. The loneliness that had once gnawed at him, the weight of old regrets, they had all eased because of this dog. Sometimes the ones we rescue end up saving us in ways we never expect. And for Ethan, that made Shadow not just a companion, but family.